Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today I want to walk you through some of the sketchbooks I've made in the past, from the very oldest ones to more recent ones, share with you a few things that I have learned, what I look for in a sketchbook, and how I like to make them now. So the one you're seeing right now is probably the oldest sketchbook that I made, and even though the date that you saw there said 2017, this one was actually from 2016, and it was made out of very heavy watercolor paper. So 140-pound watercolor paper is like the standard, and that last one was like 300-pound watercolor paper. So that one was too heavy and it was stitched together very loosely. This is a more recent one that I showed in my last sketchbook tour, and that one was stitch bound. This one here was an accordion sketchbook, and this one has no stitching at all. There's just a bit of extra paper and some glue. And if you guys are interested in tutorials for any of these specific methods, just let me know and I'd be happy to make individual videos. This one, even though it's an accordion sketchbook, does still open like a normal sketchbook and you can turn the pages. This one here I would say is probably a good representation of the stitching I like to use currently. This particular method is referred to as a kettle stitch binding, and we will talk a little bit more about that later on in the video. And this is the most recent sketchbook that I have made. This one is a bit choppy looking, and it's actually made out of cheap watercolor paper from Arleesha. I like to be able to paint in my sketchbooks, so sometimes, like in the one I showed before, I'll use different types of paper, but this one in particular is just cheap watercolor paper, and with the same stitching type as the one before. It's that kettle stitch. And what I like about this stitch is your paper is organized into individual signatures, which means 3 or so pages that are folded in half are stuck inside one another and then stitched together in that way. And what that does is it allows the binding to stay flat. So no matter what page I'm working on, as I turn the pages, it's gonna stay flat every time. And that has to do with those series of folded pages that are put together into individual signatures. You can have more or less pages in a signature. I think I had like 3 folded pages together in a signature. I think the best way for me to illustrate this point is to just go ahead and put together a sketchbook with you today. I'm showing you here some of the different types of paper I like to use. Sometimes I can use like cheap watercolor paper. If I want something fancy, I'll use something more expensive. But today we're going to be working with this full sheet. And in case you're wondering how large this is, here's my head and arm for an approximate reference of the size of this paper. Anyway, let's talk about how I measured this out before we get started. I spent quite a bit of time measuring and trying to figure out the best way to get the most pages out of this without making the pages too small, because I do prefer to work in larger sketchbooks. So what I decided to do was to evenly fold the paper into individual pages. I prefer folding and then ripping my pages as opposed to cutting them, because it gives me more of that natural raw edge of the paper, as you're going to see here. I usually just fold my paper, use a bone folder to press that flat, or you can use like a butter knife or anything, a plastic ruler, something that's just going to make that fold very, very firm and rigid and really start to change the texture of the paper. And this is going to be really helpful in keeping all of my edges nice and natural and not have to worry about messing them up when I cut them or something like that. After I've got that folded in half, I think I decided to turn this into 8 individual pieces of paper that I then folded in half to make 16 sheets, if that makes sense. 16 sheets, which would be front and back 32 pages, I believe. I hope. I really hope that's what I did. But so what you're seeing here is this is a full sheet of watercolor paper, so like 22 by 30 inches approximately, and I broke that down into 8 individual pieces of paper. Now, once all of those pieces of paper are folded and cut and all of that, the process you're seeing here, they get folded in half, and the folded in half version of these pieces is going to be our individual pages. And I know it seems a little confusing when I talk about it, but that's why I wanted to show a bit more of this process to you. I really like taking the time to fold and rip my pages. I enjoy the sketchbook making process, and I would really encourage you to give sketchbook making a try if you like crafting things and making your own items. If you're just trying to like quickly have a sketchbook and you don't want to spend money, you can do this, but especially when you're planning to stitch, it always takes a little bit longer than you might think. So allow yourself some time. I had a big thermos of tea, I was listening to music, and I just relaxed and enjoyed the process of making a sketchbook. I did make this in a couple of hours max. The math took some time, but that's kind of the part that takes a lot of time. So here you can see the first pages are starting to come together. I'm taking these sheets and I am folding them in half to get my individual pages. Now, if I was to set these pages inside of each other, which you will see in a second here, what would happen is, because the corners, those inside edges would meet, the inner pages would stick out more, and my booklet, it wouldn't be flat. So let me show you what I mean here. It's a little bit hard to demonstrate just by talking. If I put these pages inside of each other, you're going to see that the inner page sticks out a little bit further. Now, you can compensate that by just cutting off the edges, going slowly and carefully with an X-Acto knife or something like that. But in order to avoid having to cut my paper, because I really like the raw natural edges, I'm just going to make each folded piece its own signature, and I will stitch them together separately. So I know I've talked about this before, but a signature is just the folded group of pages. You can do like what I have here, which is just each page is its own signature. You can put them inside themselves like I did in other sketchbooks and make groups of signatures, but this one I'm just doing one single sheet signatures. I hope that makes sense. And I also wanted to say that as long as your papers are the same size, it doesn't matter what kind of paper you use, generally speaking. So let's say you wanted to make a mixed media sketchbook, you wanted to have watercolor paper, but you don't want to waste your watercolor paper by just sketching on it when you're not in a place where you're ready to paint, you just want to do some sketches. You can alternate between regular sketching paper and watercolor paper, and that's fine. You can do that as long as they're the same size. You can still put them in signatures together, you can stitch them together. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that before we move on. What I'm doing now is I'm just marking out the places where I'm going to be stitching. It doesn't really matter if they're equally spaced apart. You want to get them relatively even just so your binding is a bit more secure, but as you can see, I didn't really measure. I just have to make sure I keep my sketchbook pages in the right direction, so if one of them got flipped upside down, they wouldn't match anymore. So I have to keep them straight together and make sure that each page is marked for this next step, so I can make sure that each page gets holes in it properly without missing the mark. And sometimes if you don't do those pencil lines accurately, you can kind of miss some pages and they won't be marked. So I'm going to show you an unnecessarily close footage of myself threading a needle, because I really like threading needles, guys. I actually used to be really into crocheting and knitting, and I actually spun my own yarn for a while, so I think I've gotten younger as time passed because I'm not like a spinster anymore. I don't know. Anyway, I thought I would be able to show you guys this entire stitching process. You know, I would just leave my thing right here and put the camera there and you guys would get to see this process. But the truth is, filming stitching a sketchbook is so hard. I don't know how people do it, but one person who does it very, very, very well, her YouTube channel is called Sea Lemon, and I'm gonna leave a link here now thing. Go check out her channel, and I will link her Kettle Stitch binding video. That is how I stitched this. I'm sorry I'm not showing it to you now, but this is what it looks like when it's all finished. It's so hard to film, guys. Anyway, this is how those pages looked when they're all stitched together with our nice raw edges on the end. And you can technically glue the edges. Here I actually glued a watercolor painting to the cover of my sketchbook and then just sealed it with Mod Podge, which is just like an all-purpose finishing glue sealant sort of thing. And I did those things. I used some heavy cardstock folded in half for the cover, put washi tape around the outside edges. I didn't glue this one. Gluing it will make your binding more secure. So if you find that your pages are loose and your signatures kind of wobble around and your stitching isn't super tight, that's not necessarily because you didn't stitch tight enough. It's probably just because the stitch binding, there's always going to be a little bit of space between your individual signatures, and gluing will really help with that. So you can clamp your pages, paint some glue on them with a paintbrush, and leave it to dry under some pressure like some books overnight, and that will be super, super helpful. I figured since I didn't show you the actual stitching of the sketchbook, which arguably is like the most crucial part, I figured I would take the time to go ahead and paint and / draw on the first page for you guys and at least share some art with you. I don't normally show my sketching process. As you may have noticed earlier, I was kind of holding my sketchbook up towards me. It's really hard for me to put the sketchbook flat on the table to record it and draw because of the distortion of the angle. When the picture's not facing directly towards me, it's hard to not have that be distorted. So the paper that I'm using here is pretty old, actually. This is Sanders and Waterford, I think? Watercolor? Or is it Saunders and Waterford? One of those. It's watercolor paper. It's good watercolor paper, and it's probably close to 30 years old. It's been on a shelf in the basement of wherever my father-in-law lived, and he used to do watercolor paintings but hasn't for a very long time, so he just kept this paper for a long time. I've used most of it now, and this is maybe the last full sheet of it, I think, actually, I used to make this sketchbook. So this is the last bit of 30-year-old watercolor paper, and it has definitely aged. The paper, obviously can see it's not white. I think this is a natural white. I think it was not completely white before, but oh my goodness, we're already out of time. I know that went super quickly, but I hope you guys have enjoyed a bit of this look into my sketchbook process. I like to bind my sketchbooks with watercolor paper. I prefer stitching over cutting. Thank you guys for watching this video. I'm sorry that I rambled so much. I hope it was helpful and useful, and I will see you next time. Bye!